Hi there. Welcome to the Irish Screen Studies webinar series of 2018. My name's Drs Hunter. I'm at Maynooth University.
And I'm Drs Chambers from University College Cork.
And today we're going to talk about emotional labor in academia. We're going to talk for about 40-ish minutes, and then the participants who are watching this today might have some questions for us afterwards. A couple quick notes before we start. Some of the participants haven't logged in yet, so if you're watching this in the future and we have to do some finagling between our PowerPoint and muting people, apologies in advance, although maybe we'll edit all of that out.
Maybe, yeah.
Also, I think it's worth noting before we start that neither Kira nor I are experts in this area, right? We were both interested in the topic, and we thought doing a webinar on it would sort of force us or help us to learn more about it. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And because we're coming to this kind of from a new perspective, we hope that maybe you can kind of learn along with us, and we'll open up some questions, I think, that raise commonalities that I think a lot of academics will recognize, and maybe they're unsaid issues that occur, and so we just wanted to kind of open that space up for discussion a little bit.
That's it.
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to open up a PowerPoint. You'll hear our voice, but mostly see the slides. That's going to take a couple little clicks, and I want to go up here. Screen share. Oh, it's doing this thing again.
Whoa.
Stop presenting. Stop everything. Okay, we're going to try that again. It does this every once in a while. Screen share. And stop. Not exactly sure why that's happening. Do this. We had it working perfectly before, and as usual, it looks like it's going to keep. Try that.
Yeah.
Can you
That's
look?
Working, yeah.
It's full screen.
There a minute ago.
Okay, so we might have to then just do it this way.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for your patience. We are going to talk today, as we've said, about emotional labor in academia. And just to give you a quick outline of what we'll talk about, I'm going to start by briefly outlining a little bit of the term's origin, its history, some of the ways that its definition has undergone changes, especially in the past few years as it's become more popularized. A few key terms that we came across researching this that still get talked about in the sociological literature, but not so much in the kind of popular discussion around emotional labor, and a little bit about why this has become a term so associated with gender and gender roles in the workplace. And then to get more specific, Kira is going to talk a little bit about how this plays out in academia, jobs that we all do, but also its relationship to gender. And we might sort of jump in on each other's parts a little bit. And then at the end, we hope to give just a few recommendations. We're aware that this is an area that is fraught with tension and potential difficulties. So the recommendations that we give maybe aren't for everybody. And the most important thing is, if you recognize any kinds of power imbalances in your workplace, to make sure that your employment is safe, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah. Before
you bring up the issue to somebody who might not recognize it at first. The other thing is there will probably be some generalizations in here, and we are aware from the outset that not all men do certain things and not all women respond to certain things in certain ways. But to talk about this, sometimes it helps to use those generalities. Is that right? Okay, so then we'll get going. Emotional labor is a term, as you may know, that was coined by the American sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild in a book she wrote in 1983 called The Managed Heart. And she's talking about how feelings and emotions work in the commercial workplace. And for Hochschild, it was very much a workplace situation. So she actually came up with a different term, which she called emotion work, which she used to describe similar conditions of emotional labor in the private sphere. Today, emotional labor tends to get used, at least popularly, for all of these instances, at work and at home and in the other aspects of your private life. But just so you know that if you're talking about it to an academic who studies it, they might differentiate between these terms. And what Hochschild called emotional labor, as it says on the screen, was emotional labor requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. In other words, you have to control your emotions in order to manage the emotions of others. And Hochschild recognized that there were certain jobs, certain modes of employment that required this for the job to be successful. And we'll talk more about those in just a second. She also described the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and body display. And I think that's very important because that's a physical manifestation of the labor that's involved. So it's not just trying to make yourself feel good inside, but actually projecting it through how you move, how you look, the gestures you make and the expressions you make. For Hochschild, and we'll only touch on this a little bit, but this is one of the areas that I think gets dropped or at least sort of elided over in discussions of it today. Emotional labor is sold for a wage and therefore has exchange value. And maybe it doesn't in the way that it's talked about today. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So one of the things that she noticed was that emotional labor often occurs or often is expected. It occurs in lots of places, but is often expected in work that was traditionally a kind of gendered work, women's work. So employment positions requiring regular emotional labor have traditionally been those seen as women's work. And she looked at, for example, flight attendants and bank tellers and waitresses. And you can see the difference between the pilot who's at the front of the plane, who, yes, has a lot of work to do, but is managing the plane and the flight attendant who is in the cabin managing the emotions of the passengers. And of course, there are male flight attendants more frequently and so on. But the idea is that the flight attendant's job is to keep us safe, to show us the exits, to tell us how to inflate our inflatables, and to give us food and to try to sell us duty-free and all that. But another part of their job is to make sure we feel safe and happy, regardless of how difficult or cranky or angry we as passengers might be. And the same for bank tellers and the same for waitresses, nurses and doctors. And obviously in the last 20 years, the gender roles related to these have blurred. But I think it's important to remember that when we get to talking about the way emotional labor is discussed today, because it is often used as a term to describe gendered situations. So just a couple of key terms that come up in the sociological literature that are important to keep in mind. One is what's today called display rules. Hochschild actually called it feeling rules. And I think we know about this. This is, as Matsumoto Huang described it, the cultural norms learned early in life, and I would say throughout life, that govern the regulation of expressive behaviors depending on social context. Those social contexts can be national, they can be regional. You know, we think about the difference between the way, to be very general, Northern Europeans and Southern Europeans express themselves and express their emotions. City and country, and within institutions. So carers have different display rules than corporate presidents and this sort of thing. But we aren't always aware how aware we are of these. And that's what's important. They're so ingrained in us that we act according to these display rules without knowing that we're doing so. And acting leads to the next set of terms. And I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly, but scholars working in this area talk about acting, and they mean acting in two senses. One is to take action or just to perform an action, but the other is acting as performance. And when they discuss emotional labor, they describe acting in three ways: genuine acting, deep acting, and surface acting. And just quickly to talk about genuine acting, this is basically when you feel good about what you're doing. And so your performance is genuine. So I think about, for example, in academia, teaching. Some people love teaching. They got into academia because they love teaching. So when they get in front of a classroom, they don't have to act happy. Now, maybe you do on some days because you had a bad day or because things are going on in your personal life or whatever it might be. But generally, their performance in front of the classroom is genuine. So little emotional labor is required there because your actual feelings are in alignment with the rules about the emotion that you're expected to perform in the classroom. Emotional labor starts to come about more with what scholars call deep acting. And this is when one's expressed or performed emotions don't match your actual feelings. So, for example, to use teaching again, you're an academic and you have to teach, but you're inexperienced or you're anxious or you're shy. I mean, a lot of academics are introverts and you feel uncomfortable. However, you are open to coming to a place in your career where you can be happy about teaching. So the pretending for you, you draw on your training, you draw on past experiences, and the pretending feels okay. It still requires emotional management because you're nervous or you're shy and you're pretending to be happy, but it's an emotional management that you feel comfortable with and it seems okay to you. So Mittal and Chabra call this faking with good intentions. And then the next one, and this is where discussions around emotional labor generally lie, and this is what's called surface acting. So as with deep acting, your emotions don't match the required display of emotions that the task expects of you. You fake the emotion to conform to the situational display rules, to keep your job, to earn rewards, to earn favor from your supervisors or higher ups. And this occurs even when the employee knows that the required task is wrong or unnecessary or unpleasant. And Mittal and Chabra call this faking with bad intentions. And this is the situation where you are asked to do something or expected to do something or silently or maybe not silently kind of prodded to do something that you don't believe you should have to do for whatever reason. And this occurs across genders. And we'll get to that more in a moment. But this is where the concept of emotional labor has really taken off popularly. So both deep acting and surface acting require emotional labor. Both require one to fake one's emotions in order to manage another's emotions, your students, your colleagues, visiting scholars, whoever it might be. And both are technically unpaid and maybe even unacknowledged most of the time, but might affect your employment or pay, reviews and this sort of thing. But it's the large discrepancy between surface acting and deep or genuine acting where emotional difficulties come in, because surface acting, especially if it's required regularly, calls you to make great emotional effort and great emotional management. And this can lead to emotional exhaustion. And this can lead to that sense that even when you're not at work, in your private sphere, you're managing your emotions about work because you have this sense that I have to be happy about this. I'm happy that I have a job. I'm happy that these people respect me. So to maintain that, I have to continue to do these things and be happy about them. It's the doing of them and the being happy about them that causes the emotional distress. And there are plenty of studies now showing that this emotional distress and the potential for emotional breakdowns are very real in the workplace when there's a lot of expectations of emotional labor placed on people. The definition has broadened in recent years. It's become more popular. So it's a Twitter term. It's a think piece term in popular magazines and so on. And part of how it's broadened is because of its connotations of work or tasks that are traditionally performed by women. That was on the slide about flight attendants and pilots and so on. Because it tends to be unpaid and unacknowledged, and because it requires a certain amount of emotional management, the term has taken on a broader meaning, and this is how you'll see it written about a lot. Any of the tasks that women are more frequently expected to take on in a workplace environment. So oftentimes now you'll hear emotional labor used to describe not the actual act of managing emotions, as Hochschild first described it, but rather the task itself. Obviously, they're related. So we've got a few examples here. Taking minutes when the chair of the department or whoever's running the meeting says who's going to take minutes, and everyone sits there in silence. And then one of the women present says, "I'll take the minutes," and everyone goes, "Okay, she always does. That's great," in their heads. Some people deem that right there the emotional labor, where other people deem the smile on her face the emotional labor. So these terms are still a little bit unsettled. And it's worth knowing that, because if you get into a conversation with someone about it, it's always good to clarify the way that the term is being used. So that's just a little background about how emotional labor as a term has evolved. And now Kira's going to talk a little bit about how it plays out in an academic environment.
Okay, so there are many ways in which emotional labor is mobilized in terms of an academic environment. And this is particularly associated with women's tasks, but also with early career researchers in many cases. So as Aaron talked about, there's the performative aspect of teaching, which can often be quite difficult for PhD students and early career researchers until they become comfortable in that role. There's also a sense in some cases of imbalance. If you're a young female academic teaching mature male students, there are countless examples of where this becomes problematic, and those students can be disruptive in your classroom and make your job quite difficult. And they can challenge your authority, and this requires a lot of extra emotional labor in order to manage that and to manage the situation for all students in the class. It also can be found in aspects of research, for example, constructing peer review, and we'll talk a little bit more about communication in a minute. But often peer reviewers who are more aware of the emotional needs of the reviewee will think very carefully about how they write and construct their feedback in order to better manage the potential response or the potential negative reaction to criticism that might need to be given in order to, for example, improve the work under review. There's also aspects of this in terms of advising both colleagues and students, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and a range of other examples that I think people will probably recognize. There are countless examples, so we're just going to cover some of these. So in terms of teaching and research, if we're enjoying our teaching and we're building up our confidence, that emotional labor can be less arduous for us and often positive. And that's where perhaps we get endorsement and feedback, and we go in and we're tired, we've been up all night with a sick child maybe, and we have to put that aside and teach our class. But if we don't require a huge amount of emotional labor to be there, if we're enjoying teaching, we can set our other difficulties aside and get on with the performance, and that can be rewarding. It's interesting to note that more experienced faculty members tend to engage in less emotional labor, and again, that comes with experience. So if you can go in to a class that you're very comfortable with, you know the material really well, then you don't have to take that extra aspect of performance in with you. It's interesting that men tend to engage in less emotional labour than women in some of the studies we've looked at. But in most cases, regardless of gender, emotional labour goes unrewarded in academia. It's that extra mile that we run in order to support our students and our colleagues, and it's often unrecognised, and it's kind of a culture that occurs. And again, it's a culture like that learned behaviour as children that we're indoctrinated into and that we're expected to perform, and often that culture is highly gendered. In terms of advising, it was interesting to note that students have higher expectations of female staff regarding personal favours and their emotional needs. So a student in crisis will often choose to go to a female member of staff. If you have a large cohort of students, they all have a lot of deadlines, they're struggling with their time management, and you have meeting after meeting after meeting, and those students tend to single out some members of staff rather than others, then there's a disparity there in that workload and in the emotional labour that's done. It's interesting also to note that male staff who nurture are evaluated more positively than their female counterparts. So it's expected of women, it's not necessarily expected of men, and when men perform that nurturing role, then it's valued more by students. Looking at some of the other gendered tasks, communication is a huge area where emotional labour needs to be mobilised. And this is in connection with, for example, emails, the tone of your email, how long you spend constructing it, how often you read it again to make sure that it's not misconstruing anything, how you think about the email in terms of how it'll be received. So there are some studies to suggest that female academics, for example, use a lot more exclamation marks or punctuation or even smiley faces in their emails because they want to make sure that there's a warm tone as part of the email. They perhaps spend longer writing emails. They perhaps write emails that are longer. They put in extra time in terms of preparing their communication for other colleagues because they're managing the emotional responses or the potential emotional responses of colleagues. They also spend a great deal more time interpreting the tone of emails. And again, this is added emotional labor. As well as taking minutes as just the expected format of meetings, there's also the coordination of events, and particularly it's low-level admin that's associated more with female staff than with male staff. So if you think of organising a conference, the low-level admin is often dished out to early career researchers or female academics, because perhaps they're seen to be more organised than their male counterparts. And we talked a little bit about this before the webinar, the notion that male colleagues, and again we're generalizing here, so this is not to categorize everyone in this way, but some male colleagues feign incompetence at certain admin tasks, so their female colleagues will take it on. In relation to entertainment and the hosting of speakers, for example, admin tasks associated with women are often to do with room bookings, with organising refreshments, with travel arrangements, with minding visiting speakers and managing their expectations, running errands for them, making sure they're comfortable in their accommodation, and more frequently succumbing to bizarre and unusual requests for extra support or help. And again, this is often that's directed towards particularly early career female colleagues. In terms of emotional management, student feedback is often something that emotional labour is employed within. So the notion of presenting feedback that's constructive, that's again trying to gently reassure the student rather than overly critique them. This also forms part of pastoral care. How nurturing are you? How open are you to performing emotional labour, keeping up the smiling face to a student who's difficult, who presents conflict to you, but because you're managing their needs and expectations, there's this extra impetus there to perform kind of surface acting within these tasks. We're also highly mobilized by the university to think about student surveys and student feedback on staff performance. This is a crucial part of our kind of cultural discourse in terms of how we support students. And that's a very difficult area because academic members of staff are expected to perform pastoral care with a wide variety of complex needs, and yet there often isn't a support structure for staff in dealing with those emotional needs. The university leaves staff to deal with this. It's an unpaid extra part of their job, and often there aren't policies and procedures to support staff through that. We also tend to try and support our colleagues if we engage with a lot of emotional labour, and that can be a difficult and draining and exhausting process. So all of this extra work is leading us to burnout. It's exhausting us. It's mentally draining for us. So we thought we'd maybe talk a little bit about some advice we could suggest in terms of dealing with all of these issues.
Right. And just to sort of reiterate what we said at the beginning, um, all tasks of emotional labor are situational. We're aware of that. And that's part of the literature going all the way back. So the first thing to say before we get into the advice, and we'll bring this up again near the end, is just to be careful and be sort of protective of yourself, because a lot of people just aren't aware of this, and this is some of the advice we have to give for senior faculty members. But if someone's confronted with the notion that they're manipulating you or taking advantage of you in terms of your emotional labor load, and they're not even aware that emotional labor is a thing, then that can come across as confrontational or even aggressive. On the other hand, you might be in a department where you have emotional labor workshops and people are very aware of it. So as we give this advice, it's just worth, don't do everything we say just because we say it. Not that anybody would, but make sure you're aware of what your departmental setup is like and how receptive people are and that sort of thing. And maybe it takes education first before anyone will be willing to do anything about it. So we broke it down into advice for senior faculty. We just have a few tips for them, advice for men, and advice for early career researchers. So do you want to?
So being aware of kind of power structures and the culture within your university is really essential. And sometimes this can take a long time. If you're new to university, it can be confusing and bewildering to try and work out what the culture is. But trying to understand that will really help in terms of trying to understand some of the hierarchical power imbalances and relationships that are there. It's also, and obviously in terms of senior staff, remembering that for early career researchers, remembering that process is bewildering when you go to a new institution. So kind of nurturing an open and transparent culture in terms of addressing power imbalances would be quite important for senior staff. It's also important to consider unconscious bias training. And unconscious bias is unconscious because we're not aware of it, and yet it has deep and profound effects on our actions and our thinking and our ethos and approach to our work. If you're a senior member of staff and you can offer mentorship to others, genuine, constructive, productive mentorship, then that is invaluable. I know personally I've benefited from hugely significant mentoring through my PhD supervision and through more experienced colleagues who have kind of helped me navigate this very tricky path in terms of academic relationships. If you're male members of staff, it's important to be open to learning about emotional labor and to be aware of some unconscious biases and not to feel under attack. And I don't think that any member of staff wants to single out a particular group or attack people. This is very much about having open conversations. And also I think it's important for men not to feel attacked as individuals as we discuss some of these issues. And again, we're really generalizing here. We don't want to single out any individuals. I see really empowered male colleagues who are completely all over this and are working very hard to address some of these long-term issues that have built up in terms of gender power structures in academia.
I think it's also worth saying on that note that for male faculty and men in other fields, if you've stumbled across this video, go read a little bit about this also. Don't take our word for it. It might seem like this is a buzzword of the last few years and that it's become especially prevalent in the wake of Me Too, and that's all great. But there are 30 years of research into emotional labor, how it works, how it plays out across different fields, not just in academia. And because of unconscious bias, because of the way these display rules are so ingrained in us, we don't always see it. We don't see it as men when we're required to perform it. And there's all kinds of cultural reasons that we don't have time to get into about how men are or are not in touch with their emotions. But even more so because we don't experience the kind of emotional labor demands as frequently or as regularly as women do, we also don't see that happening. We fall back on our unconscious biases and expect as we said earlier, oh, she's doing the minutes again. She always did the minutes. She must like doing the minutes. She's smiling, right? So really, go out, read a little bit more about it, and be open to the fact that it's real, right?
And also, I think listening to female colleagues when they describe their experiences, not dismissing them and not feeling personally attacked by them, but just listening and hearing, that is hugely empowering for female colleagues to feel listened to by their other colleagues. And it can go a long way in terms of addressing some of the fallout from this performed emotional labor. Also, volunteering to take on some of the tasks generally deemed female or that might fall outside your comfort zone in order to be collegial and to be a supportive member of staff can go a long way.
Right. Kira mentioned earlier that there's research that's been done about how men can, and sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. It's their own strategy for navigating the workplace, but can feign ignorance or feign inability. Recognize that in yourself. So when you're like, well, I've never taken the minutes before, I don't know how to take minutes. It's a list of what people say in a meeting. It's not really hard. It's not fun, but it's not fun for anybody. So part of recognizing our own unconscious biases as men is to recognize when we take advantage of them. And it's a little bit of self-reflection, and that's a good thing. We're academics. We're supposed to be thinking about ourselves. So volunteer to take those tasks on, but also just ask yourself why you haven't before, and then, yeah, do it.
So in terms of early career researchers, this is a very difficult time because there are all sorts of reasons why you could be in danger. Your job may not be secure. You're trying to establish your identity as an academic in terms of your research and your teaching. So we thought it was important to remember to be careful in terms of how you broach some of these issues. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important to try and see who's culturally aligned with you within a department. You'll often find that you're working with very diverse colleagues, and some of them will be completely aligned with your philosophy and some of them won't. So finding those who are on the same page as you can be really, really constructive and helpful. And when you spend time with those colleagues, you find comfort and solace in your conversations with them, in perhaps their mentoring of you, and just in general discussions in relation to some of the many complex issues and the growing range of complex issues that we face as academics. There's an interesting support group online, the Women in Academia Support Network. It's a closed group on Twitter that you can, on Facebook, sorry, that you can apply to join, or you can follow them on Twitter. They regularly post, both anonymously and openly, dilemmas that people face in the workplace in academia. And there's such a complex range of discussion that comes up, and colleagues from all over the world comment and offer advice. And they also share policies and procedures from different institutions. This is an incredibly useful forum for gathering information, or for even putting out there a dilemma that you have that you're not really sure how to navigate. It's really, really important to look after yourself, to think of healthy coping strategies, to feel empowered to say no when you simply cannot take on any more work. And often this is difficult because we build up frustrations in terms of seeing workloads that are not equitable across departments. And it's very frustrating to see that the same people keep saying yes. And because they're productive and they get through the tasks, they're given more. It's not the case that that workload is often shifted or spread out more fairly. So it's okay to say no, and don't feel always that you have to give a reason for saying no. I think that's important to state as well. But finding also ways to add value to your life in terms of your hobbies, in terms of spending time with good friends and colleagues, that is nourishing, and it helps empower you to go on in this really draining, emotionally laborious work that we do. So it's really important in terms of making room for that. Don't make self-care the last thing on your list. Make sure that it's built into your timetable, it's built into your week, and you'll find your academic work all the more fulfilling if you can find coping strategies to deal with it.
And also, we put on here, self-care is necessary, and it's okay. One of the things that we find, and perhaps you do it as well, is that when you're taking time for some healthy coping strategies or self-care, or putting away the work, the guilt comes in. And that's a whole other layer of emotional management that you have to deal with. I should be working on that paper. I should be planning the class. It's Saturday night, and it's New Year's Eve, and I'm correcting an essay. So it's okay. And that can be really hard to believe because of the pressures around all of the other emotional labor that you get caught up in. So maybe make it a mantra or something. It's okay that I'm having fun. It's okay that I'm relaxing. It's okay that I'm taking an extra long bath, or whatever it is that you do, going for a hike in the woods, to just kind of clear your mind, let go of those things for a little while, and recharge your batteries, because you'll be better for it in the workplace.
And one thing I've been reading about a lot recently is sleep, and the power of sleep to have a direct impact on your work, your working environment, and your relationships with your colleagues. So people who are sleep deprived are more likely to make mistakes. They're more likely to read an intonation or a tone in an email that isn't there. They're more likely to be misled by a conversation with another member of staff. They're more likely to snap in the classroom if a student isn't behaving the way they'd like. So it's important to kind of think about that in terms of getting enough rest in order to keep up with the demanding work that we do, but also to acknowledge that if colleagues are sleep deprived, it may affect the way they respond to you and the way they interact with you.
And so I think that's it for advice, and maybe that's it for, hey, look, they're cheering for us. Thanks for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing this now, and I'm going to unmute the participants, I think. And can you say something so I see if I unmuted you properly? No.
How about now?
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
So if you have any questions or just some things to contribute, we'd be happy to have a chat for 10 or 12 minutes or so.
Yeah.
It's hard to discuss it without kind of relying on anecdotes.
Right.
And we've all been in kind of difficult situations. Kind of personally, I've recently stepped down from a managerial and leadership role inside the school because I found myself putting my kids in the bath for an extra long bath so that I could write the lecture for the next day, because I'd spent all my time doing staff management things. And you end up in these moments of kind of snap and realization, but it takes for it to get to that point for you to realize the path that you kind of traveled down. We have, when you talk about the kind of feigned incompetence often of male members of staff, we have two kind of categories of, we have plate droppers and good soldiers. The good soldiers get more and more work, and we have the plate droppers, those people that start their job in the restaurant and sure they drop the plate on the first day, and then they don't have to be the person who clears and scrapes the plates. That's how you get out of jobs, is dropping plates and making a mess. So the only question I think I've got is around your framing of self-care, which I think is a little problematic, because at times you talk about self-care, you know, take a long bath, take a walk in the woods because you need that break from work because it will make you better at your work.
Yeah.
So there's like a logical loop there that says, like, take some time for yourself because then you'll be a better worker. And we're always locked in this logic of performance management of ourselves and trying to, and I think often it's, you know, how many times has somebody said to you in academia, thanks, you're doing a really good job?
Yeah.
From a manager, from a colleague, from somebody inside the department. So I think that because of that, we kind of internally mark ourselves on this kind of performance thing, and then you end up taking breaks so that you can be better. You know, if I take the afternoon off, then like I'll be a better writer tomorrow. Not like I need time off because I need to be away from all of this, but because I'll come back fighting stronger tomorrow. And I think that I don't know how you get out of that logic, but I find myself in that logic, and it kind of came through a little bit in your talk, I think, when you were talking about self-care.
Yeah, and it's almost contradictory to say take some time out and also stop engaging with all this emotional labor, but then on the other hand, support your colleagues and be collegial and watch out for others who are struggling with emotional labor. It's a constant balancing act. I think in terms of efficiency, there are ways that we can streamline what we do. I mean, we all spend far too much time reading and answering emails. So I know that some people who suggest just do that twice a day, set aside an hour twice a day. And if you don't get to that email, you don't answer it. That's really hard to do, and it takes a lot of discipline, but it certainly can improve in terms of productivity. Or leaving aside 2 hours a day to do deep work, not the admin. This might be thinking about a funding bid, or drafting the outline for an article, or reading some articles. But if you don't actually carve that time aside, then you don't get it. It doesn't happen, and you push it to the end of the list, and then you feel you must do your research in your holidays, as some members of staff like to suggest to you. So it's about strategizing how to be more efficient in the way you work so that you can leave that time aside. But yeah, it's difficult and challenging. And then dealing with the guilt, as Aaron mentioned, of feeling that you've taken time out, that you're not doing a good enough job. And we are our own worst critics. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking how we're perceived and how our performance is perceived, instead of concentrating on what's fulfilling for us within the job, what gives us a reason to keep working in this job. And so changing the conversations and our mindset, and at least being aware of some of these issues, is a start. But yeah, it is hard to make those long-term cultural changes.
I think the other thing is that in this paradox that you brought up, which it's a very good one, is to recognize and accept that we're almost always engaged in some sort of emotional labor, like when you go to the shop and you have to deal with the person at the till and stuff. So it's hard not to be. And then some of us even engage with it with ourselves and the way we manage our emotions, because we think we're supposed to be a certain way and that will make us actually happier. So it's hard to switch it off completely. But the other thing within that work environment, to recognize that it's going to continue to go on, however enlightened your department or your colleagues are. Partly just because academia is one of those professions, because it includes teaching, and because it often includes collaboration, where emotional management is necessary. It's just part of that interfacing with other people. As Kara brought up, that especially if you're early in your career, or you're in a department where maybe it's kind of less enlightened, or less, not enlightened, switched on or aware, that there are going to be demands made on you that are unreasonable and unfair, and that drive you nuts. And you kind of do have to recharge your batteries to jump back into that. So unfortunately, we can't just walk into our departments and say, hey, did you know? And then tomorrow it's solved, right? It's itself is a struggle. So I think there is a little bit to that. And I'd like, if you have suggestions of different ways to frame it, because it's something like we said at the very top, we've just started kind of looking into this and reading about it just so we can learn about it better ourselves. But if you have suggestions, we'd be happy to.
One of the things that we have a module that we teach the students, and it's a kind of employability, workplace ready kind of a module in media. And one of the sessions is about gender balance. So what we talk about, and you know, we can embody that in kind of positivist dialogues about data, and you know, women are paid less and have to work harder and those sorts of things. But that data only becomes kind of alive when you put it in situations for the students to work through, which I think is why things like women in academia, Facebook and Twitter things are so important, because they're kind of embodied in the day-to-day, the politics of the day-to-day. And what we say to the students is you know, because the men inside the class kind of go, that's all right, gender balance, I'm on the right side of that, so I'll be grand. And you see, well, no, actually, this is a toxic situation, and this session is about helping women in those roles identify the problems when they occur, and making them aware of what's going to happen and how you navigate that. But for the men inside the room, you have to come up with strategies to help counteract that. So
right.
your social responsibility as an agent in that environment to be conscious and aware of that, and to find ways to help support other kinds of workers. So kind of recognize and check your own privilege and find ways. But nobody wants to dismantle their own privilege. Like, that's
yeah.
Why would you ever want to dismantle your own privilege? Apart from if you go through, I mean, I've worked with Kira before, and we used to talk about kind of prison mentality. Last one in. So you save all of the next guy who comes in will get all of this stuff, and that can go that way, because we'll have leveled up and we'll be outside of that kind of thing. And any institution, I think, forms that kind of prison mentality where you kind of offloading responsibilities and jobs that nobody really wants to touch.
Yeah.
And there are two ways, because we have talked about this before. We have said we're never going to be that person who offloads onto the new person in the door because they're new and they don't know any better, and they don't want to say no. So I think that is crucial, that there's a realization there that what happened to us was wrong, and that we won't perpetuate that. So because we talked about that, we acknowledged it, we could see the problem. We find it difficult to solve for ourselves, but we're very aware of it in terms of other colleagues. You also mentioned something else that's really important, and that's thanking people for what they do. We don't get that very often, but when you do get a thanks for something, it is very much appreciated. But I think also it benefits the person who sends the thank you, because they feel good about themselves for having thanked a colleague for helping them out, or having sent someone a paper saying, or sent someone an email after a paper at a conference saying, thank you for your paper, it was really useful to me. That kind of endorsement, if we can generate a culture of doing that for each other, I think that's also a step forward in terms of acknowledging what people do and thanking them for it, rather than ignoring it and just hoping that I don't have to do that job in the future. But acknowledging that someone has done something difficult or unpleasant, and thanking them for it, or thanking them for doing extra work, or even just thanking them for doing the work that they're expected to do. If we can generate a bit more of a culture of that, I think that could change things too.
And I think related to that, and related to what you were saying about the classroom and the students in the classroom, and this is hard to kind of quantify for people, for young men, but and it's going to sound a little bit trite, but like a happy work environment is better for everyone. And if colleagues are sharing the load equally and feeling good, sharing the feeling good equally, if there's a way to parcel that out, then they're going to be more inclined to want to help you in the future. You might need someone to cover a class for you, or whatever it might be, to work on a paper together, or just to have pleasant departmental meetings, those sorts of things, so that if men can become aware, and if senior academics, male and female, can become more aware of making that situation more equitable, everyone will benefit, including those men, I think, who are in the department. I don't know.
It leads to huge frustration when there's an imbalance in terms of workloads, as we know. And I think that if you can engage in a successful workload model where everyone actually has the genuine same amount of work, and it's not fabricated in some way, then that leads to a sense of at least fairness in the department. Okay, we're all overworked, but we're all equally overworked.
Right.
And I think that's hugely important in terms of collegial relationships, that you don't look at someone who's getting away because they're bullshit and they don't want to do the work, and someone else who's had to take it on because they can't say no. So I think that equity in terms of working relationships is really important.
I had a really interesting conversation with our PVC for research, which was about this idea of being ref ready. So having all of your outputs ready for ref, and that some people inside institutions are saying, I'm ref ready already, like I'm done. And it was really nice from a managerial point of view for her to say, if you are ref ready, that is because somebody has been shoveling shit over here,
Right.
Yeah.
Increasing teaching loads, like the department is an ecosystem, and if you've locked yourself down and you're ref ready, it's because somebody else has been doing all of this work here.
Right.
And now it's your responsibility to pick up some of that to get everybody ref ready. Okay? Everybody has to work as a team. She's very progressive in terms of her support of ECRs and those sorts of things, which is great and a real change. But really nice to see people understand the shift of the ecosystem, and that when somebody takes something out of that, it really affects the other members of staff, and usually the junior and female members of staff in that ecosystem, which are the ones which need more support rather than less.
Right. That's great. I think our time is up. Thank you so much for listening and for your great insights at the end. Just to say to those who might watch this in the future, this is the last 2018 Irish Screen Studies webinar. We're thinking of calling it the Irish Screen Studies lunchtime webinar. I don't know, it might be too long. We'll find out, because we'll be back next spring. And if any academics out there who watch this, Ireland-based, UK-based, or from beyond, would be interested in taking part in one of these webinars, we'd be happy to host the platform for you. So if you or someone you know would like to do it on any topic, we generally aim them towards PhD students, early career researchers, but it doesn't have to be limited only to that. So just get in touch with us, comment on this video. We're on Facebook. We're at irishscreenstudies@gmail.com, I believe. So in any of those ways, let us know, and we can probably work something out. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in 2019.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.